Dan could hardly believe the situation he found himself in. They had taken his car, stripped him of his pride, and likely ruined his marriage. He should have known better. He had succumbed to his desires. But what on earth gave the police the authority to seize his car on top of everything else? To make matters worse, his name had landed on the list of offenders. He could call a friend to give him a ride home, but sooner or later, the news would reach Martha. She worked at the largest hospital in the city. Someone would see his name and let her know. His chest felt like it had been scraped against shards of glass. He knew she would never forgive him. He'd seen streetwalkers plenty of times, but they never caught his attention. None of them were remotely appealing. But today was different. A stunning redhead had appeared, and he couldn't take his eyes off her. Moments later, she was in his car. Her legs were mesmerizing. Even so, the thought of being with someone other than his wife felt foreign. She stated her price, options with or without a condom. He opted for without and handed her the cash. But then she cuffed him. The disappointment in his eyes must have been plain as she recited his rights. He just lowered his head in shame. A year ago, City Hall had passed new anti-prostitution laws. Those laws not only ensured offenders would face arrest but also that their vehicles would be seized. His hearing was set for tomorrow. Dan knew lying to Martha wasn't an option. As his trembling hand dialed her number, he realized her shift didn't begin for another hour. How could he betray the woman who meant the world to him? His voice cracked. "Martha, I'm so sorry." "Dan? Are you okay?" she asked, concern in her tone. "I'm sorry. Did you lose your job?" Dan hadn't even considered that possibility. It was a blow Martha couldn't afford right now, not with their third child on the way. Why couldn't he wake up and realize this was all just a terrible dream? "Martha," he stammered, "I made a mistake. I was arrested. And the car was impounded." That was all he could say. The silence that followed on the other end of the call was deafening. As a nurse, she understood exactly what being arrested and losing the car implied. She finally spoke, delivering just 2 words. "Call a cab," and then she hung up. Dan knew better than to tell her. He couldn't afford one after the police confiscated the money he'd intended to use for the prostitute. Desperate, he called Rob at work. Rob wasn't his first choice, but he had a little time to spare. Dan was an architect at one of the city's top firms. He was good at his job but knew his female bosses never quite favored him. Now, his career was on the verge of collapse. When Rob dropped him off, Martha's car was already parked outside the house. She must have left work early. Rob glanced at him and quipped, "Call me if she files for divorce. Martha's a stunner." Dan shot him a look that said, "Thanks for the ride and go to hell." He stepped out of the car, bracing himself for Martha's fury. He expected her to be waiting at the door with a suitcase packed for him. She was there, but no suitcase. She greeted him through gritted teeth. "Speak, and I'll poison your food. Touch me, and I'll cut off your hand. Leave the basement for anything other than work, and I'll cut something else off. Do you understand?" Dan nodded silently. "The boys are staying with their grandparents in Rochester for the week," she continued. "I told my mom about this because I was worried about the kids. She knows I have a gun." Dan looked at her but couldn't think of a response. She made it clear just how furious she was. "And it's only going to get worse from here. I talked to Jeannie, your boss, and arranged for you to work remotely. Lance will drive you to and from the office if needed. Also, your truck is being sold to cover your legal fees." Her words stunned him, but he didn't argue. "Do you have any objections?" she asked sharply. He shook his head. "Good. Your dinner is in the basement. Oh, and I left you a present. Good night." She stepped back to let him enter, practically locking him inside. Dan descended the stairs to the basement, fuming. Lance, disgusting Lance, was going to be his chauffeur. His truck sold without anyone asking him. And was she really on a first-name basis with his boss now? This was beyond infuriating. He couldn't handle it. On the couch in the basement, he found his suitcase and a duffel bag. Inside the bag was an inflatable doll. "Real funny, Martha," he muttered bitterly. What had he done to deserve this? How was he going to survive? What haunted him most was the look of betrayal on her face. If he lost her, he wasn't sure he wanted to live. Suddenly, a deafening bang shattered his thoughts. A blinding light filled the room. He blinked and saw Martha standing there, holding a gun. She had actually fired it into the wall. The hole in the drywall made it painfully clear. The gun was loaded, and Martha wasn't bluffing. Was this how it was going to end for him? She had never shown any violent tendencies before. Could her pregnancy and his betrayal have driven her over the edge? Clad in a black tank top and camouflage pants, she looked more intimidating than ever. A bad omen if there ever was one. She flung a length of rope at him. "Tie your feet to the bed," she ordered. Dan complied quickly, his hands fumbling. She tossed him a pair of handcuffs next. "Cuff your right hand to the bed's headboard," she commanded. He did as she asked, his pulse pounding in his ears. With the gun still firmly in her grip, she approached the bed and pulled a large knife from her waistband. She was completely unhinged. Pulling the blanket back, she revealed that he was only wearing shorts. Without a word, she slid the knife into one pant leg and made a precise cut. She repeated the process on the other leg. "Get rid of those filthy rags," she snapped. Dan removed the tattered fabric carefully and placed it beside him, deciding not to toss it onto the clean floor. She walked to the corner of the room, retrieved a bag, and pulled out an inflatable doll still in its packaging. Opening the box, she took out the doll and handed it to him. "Inflate it," she demanded. Dan began to blow into the doll, but his breath caught in his throat. Panic clawed at him as she waved the gun around wildly, her grip on reality seemingly slipping. All he could think about was the chaotic car scene in Pulp Fiction. His heart nearly stopped when she pointed the gun directly at him. "Have you ever done this before?" she asked, her voice sharp. He shook his head vehemently. "Is it because I'm pregnant?" Again he shook his head in denial. She adjusted the red wig she was wearing. "Would you prefer if I were a redhead?" Dan shook his head once more, his mind racing. How could she possibly know? As his wife, had she somehow gained access to the police report? Or had her sharp intelligence led her to uncover the truth through other means? "You paid for unprotected sex," she said, her tone icy. Dan couldn't answer. He stared at her, horrified. He knew there was no point in arguing. "You wanted someone else to give you unprotected sex? Fine." She shoved the inflatable doll toward him. "Sleep with her." Dan's eyes widened in terror. Was she serious? She pressed the gun against his temple and repeated, "I said, sleep with her." Sweat poured down his face as tears streaked his cheeks. He was going to die. There was no way out of this. Martha glanced at her watch. 3 minutes. "If you don't do it, your brains will be splattered all over the wall." Desperation overtook him. Tears streaming, he moved the doll's mouth mechanically, pretending. His mind raced with memories of every intimate moment he'd shared with Martha, trying to find a way to calm himself. But it wasn't working. It was just humiliating. He knew he was going to die. As a last resort, he tried to think of the redhead from that fateful day. Closing his eyes, he remembered how striking she'd been. When he opened them again, he saw Martha staring at him, her expression a mix of devastation and disgust. Her voice was cold and sharp. "You bastard. You don't deserve to live." She pulled the trigger. A loud pounding on the door shattered the tension. Someone was fiddling with the lock. "Open up," a man's voice barked. The door swung open, and Margaret, their neighbor, peeked in. Her face was pale, her expression one of sheer disbelief. "I'm sorry, Martha," Margaret stammered. "That movie was awful. I can't believe you wanted to borrow that old thing again. How could you have forgotten it at the office?" Martha burst out laughing, picking up the red wig and stepping back to let Margaret in. Dan, still sitting on the bed, started laughing too, his nerves completely frayed. "Alinda, I'm sorry you got stuck in traffic," Martha said, still chuckling. "We didn't even need that old thing." Dan held up the gun in his hand, which now looked more like a prop. A deflated, inflatable doll lay crumpled on the floor beside him. Alinda gave them both a look of disdain. "You two never stop, do you? Martha, you're 6 months pregnant. Shame on you. And you, Dan, don't even get me started. You called me this morning saying your grandmother was sick. She is. Dan protested weakly. That means I'm taking care of her. You better bring her some soup or I'll call her and tell her what her naughty grandson's been up to. You wouldn't dare, Dan said, wide-eyed. Oh, I will, Alinda replied, glaring. And I want both of you in my office at 8 a.m. sharp. We've got a new case to discuss. Dan and Martha exchanged sheepish looks. Alinda was their boss. Both of them were cops. The whole charade had been part of their elaborate role-playing fantasy. Martha wasn't actually pregnant. They didn't even have kids. Dan had called in sick that morning, claiming his grandmother was ill, while Martha spent her day off in a red wig. Dan wasn't her only arrest that day. Alinda pointed to the inflatable doll. And get rid of that ridiculous thing. Dan twirled the toy gun in his hand absent-mindedly, its dart still pointed at his temple. With a resigned sigh, he unloaded it and yanked the dart out of the wall. I wonder if the company that makes this toy knows what we're doing with it, he muttered.